Hey everyone, today I have a really short video about parameters and what they are and how to use them in your project. I've been really busy this week with something that I'm working on that I'm hoping to share with you all next week, but for now let's dive right into parameters. So parameters are essentially arguments or flags that you launch your project with as an executable. So rather than just the normal exe file, there's also additional information appended to the end of it. I talked about these a bit last week on the video about headless servers and how you could use these to influence the state that your project launches in. And there are additionally parameters that are defined by GameMaker initially that you can use even if you don't build these functions into your game. So we'll go over those at the end of the video. So we'll just take a quick look into what parameters look like and how they're given and interacted with through GameMaker. And to do that, I've created this really small example project that's just a few lines of code to really display what parameters are capable of. So here we have just one object with a few lines of code in the draw event. GameMaker has two functions built in that deal with parameters, and those are parameter count and parameter string. So parameter count will return to us the number of parameters that are being passed to the executable, and then parameter string is what we use to actually read those arguments. So in these few lines of code, all we're doing is we're creating a variable that contains the number of parameters that were being passed, and then we're using a for loop to print those parameters out onto the project. So let's take a quick look at what this looks like just running it from the GameMaker IDE. So the first one that we'll see is the exe file, which is the actual runner of the game. Then the next one that we'll see is the flag that says game. And that's one of those built-in GameMaker flags that we'll talk about at the end of the video. And pretty much what it's doing is just pointing towards the data file for the game. And then the last one is that actual data file. It's important to note that these are separated by spaces. So the way that GameMaker looks at the parameters is essentially that every time you have a space, that's a new parameter string. So you can, build something that strings these together. So let's say that you had a flag that you set to do a certain thing, and then you could look for the next parameter after that to be the actual indicator of what to do. So what happens when we run this regularly, like on an executable file rather than through the IDE? So we see right now that all that is returned from the regular exe is the path to the exe, and that's because that's the only parameter that was set. However, we could open up our command prompt and we could launch the exe through the command prompt and add some parameters to it. So we have our exe set, so if I press enter, it'll just load up the exe, but I'm going to add something special to it. I'll go hello world, and we'll press enter now. So now you see what opens is the same thing, except it also lists our hello and our world as two separate parameters. So let's take this a little bit further and actually do something with the parameters that we're getting. So in a new example project, I have pretty much the exact same code, except what we're doing is in the create event, we're actually loading those parameter strings into an array that we're able to search. So we set it up the same way, we count the number of parameters, and then we're going to do that same loop, except for instead of printing it to the screen, remember we now are in the create event of this object, we're going to add each parameter string to an array. And so we'll just call that p-array, and we'll increment that based on the number of loops that the for loop is going through, and each one will get the value of the parameter string that coordinates to it. Then in the draw event of that instance, we can actually search through that array and see if something exists or not. So I'm just going to check to see if the flag blue exists, and if it does, it's going to set the draw color to blue, and if not, it's going to set the draw color to white. And then we'll just draw a rectangle across the whole screen that's filled in with whatever color we're drawing. So the only special piece of this, and there are thousands of ways to go about parsing this information, but in this case I'm using a script that I wrote called inArray. And inArray is actually a direct clone of something that I went over in PHP a few weeks back that is a super handy function, and it allows you to look for a specific value inside of an array, or like a needle inside of a haystack. So you just give it the values of needle and haystack. We set the variable found to false at the beginning of the function. We check to make sure that haystack is actually an array, and then we're just going to loop through the length of the haystack array looking for the needle value. So if any of the entries in that array end up meeting the criteria to be needle, it returns true, and if not, it returns false. So here we can check after I've exported the exe if this works or not. So we're just going to launch parameters advanced, and we should just see a white screen. Yep, so that's all we got back was a white screen in a GameMaker window. Now let's try it with that blue flag. And as you see, our script worked. It saw that there's a blue parameter, and now it's drawing that blue rectangle. So there are thousands of different uses for this, and there are thousands of different ways to parse the data that you're getting from the parameters. Like I mentioned last week, I use it to create a headless flag on all of my server executables, so that whenever I want to launch it in a headless mode, I can just do dash headless, and if that's set, it'll enable all of the debug messages that I want and disable the draw event for the project. And like I mentioned, there are some actually built-in flags that the GameMaker runner and compiler have. Yo-Yo Games says that these don't work on every platform, and specifically say that they only work on Windows, which isn't necessarily the case. There are some that seem to work on other platforms just fine, but you'll have to try and experiment if you really want to use these on other platforms. So the ones that they include are dash no audio, which essentially just turns off your sound for the project. Dash in a window, which forces the game to launch in a window, which is especially useful if you have a project that is a full screen game, or if you download something and you don't have a way to disable the full screen mode based on what the developer set. And then we've got dash output, which is really useful because what it will do is you say dash output and then you put the file name, so info.txt or output.txt, whatever you want, and GameMaker will actually run all of the console information that's coming out of the runner into that file. There's also similarly debug output, which does the same thing except it excludes all of the information that you manually set, but does include extra information from the runner that output doesn't contain. Dash software, this one forces software rendering of your project rather than using any actual hardware like your graphics card. Dash Intel, and this is just a really weird bug fix. I'm not really sure exactly what's going on here, but supposedly there are certain drivers that will slow certain things down for GameMaker runners, and this is the fix for that. And then lastly, dash vanilla GFX, and that switches off the search for any specific driver manufacturers. Hey, this is Future Brian. I'm editing this video right now and realized that I forgot to include the most important command line parameter that GameMaker gives us to use, which is dash game. We did talk about it earlier in the video, and essentially all that does is it allows us to change the data file that your runner or your compiled version starts with. So the data file that you see in all of your exports is actually everything that determines what's going on inside that game. There are certain configurations that are baked into the runner, but you can just use the game flag and then point it to a different data file from a different game. GameMaker, or Yo-Yo Games specifically, says that this is really good for A/B testing, which is essentially if you wanted to have two compiled versions of your game, you could switch between the two of them really easily. So it's a really great function. And it's worth noting that you can set these without even going through the command line. So for example, you can just create a shortcut to your project. Then we'll go to Properties. And under the target name, we're just going to add the parameters that we want. So we're going to say random example. Apply. Okay? And then when we launch that shortcut, we'll see that random example is right there. So you could use this the same way, like if you wanted to have your distribution of your game or your project with multiple different shortcuts for different options for whatever reason, that would be the way to do it. Just include those shortcuts in the zip file. And that's it for parameters, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you can find some uses for those in your project. And I'll be back next week for hopefully a really exciting video. Thanks.